they understand that building that relationship and making that child's physical needs be met, making sure they're not hungry, that they feel safe and secure, that they have a safe place to stay, that they actually touch the child and actually make eye contact with that child at an early age before the child's able to speak themselves. That child reads that and knows that that person cares. And it builds that self accountability. It builds that self-sufficiency of the child. It's a parallel process. What the teacher is doing, the child is developing along at the same rate or even faster. But that teacher can make that difference by taking care of those physical needs, by making that child feel secure and safe, by showing them that you care about them and that you love them and you are building that social relationship. What that does is that instills a component of self-awareness and self-confidence in that child. And then that child is able to open up and begin to soak in all of that sun, all of that rain, and grow and become this magnificent individual that, if they don't do those things, they don't have that opportunity.
I've been talking to so many leaders about the importance, right, of early childhood development and education. Something that stuck with me since our last conversation, Dr. Snuggs, was you said back in the day, we thought that early childhood for the baby, I want to say you said like the first 2,000 days, we had just a little ball, right, of human, but we are literally impacting that child in so many different ways that it's so difficult for us to even be able to comprehend how important those early childhood development opportunities are. And I thought that was just something that was so important since our last conversation. Why is this work so important for you, Dr. Snuggs?
Well, I have been in this field now for over 30 years, and it is one of the most important things I've ever done. I think for me, it started at a very young age. I had a grandfather that was very dear to me that passed away with cancer when I was 5 years old. And I was determined that I was going to go into the medical field and help other folks so that they could have their grandfathers for longer and they could instill all that love and knowledge into you. And so I prepared myself appropriately. I went through college, graduated, with very high honors, prepared myself to go to med school and didn't get in. And I was very, very disappointed. But I remember something that my advisor told me. He told me that when I became a professional, a doctor or whatever, that I was going to be one of those that invested in other people. He told me that typically doctors, the top 10% of the class are the ones that actually teach. The middle of the class are those that actually do research. And the bottom of the class are the ones that practice. Well, of course, I didn't want to be at the bottom of the class. So I wanted to be the one that could teach others and be engaged with other folks. And so I think that's exactly what happened. And I think there was a higher power that knew better. When I didn't get into med school, I immediately went back to a master's program and really emphasized the understanding of child development and child psychology. And so in one way, it was a closed door, but in another way, it really opened up my passion. And so I finished my master's and then began working. And very soon I was able to actually secure a job as an instructor at a high institution of higher ed. And at that moment, I knew that this was where I needed to be because I loved being in front of a classroom. I loved instilling knowledge in others. I was able to share my passion. And not only was I able to understand the biological benefits for young children, I was also able to understand those psychological benefits for young children. I was able to really understand the data behind it and really brain research at an early age when other people weren't even talking about that. And I also knew that I had a way with young children. And so I knew that I wanted to do something that would make sure that they had ample opportunity and that they would reach their optimal potential. So, like I said, I went back, I ended up getting my doctorate in educational leadership, worked at the college, but also made my way to a state level position that oversaw all the programs in North Carolina, and then actually became a chief academic officer and really, really wanted to make a difference for students. And so began to be able to help people in a way that I never dreamed of. I was able to move systemic barriers so people could have access to higher education and get the excitement that I had and the understanding of how to really impact a child and a family's life.
You know who Matthew McConaughey is?
Of course. One of my heroes.
One of my heroes too. All right. You know, he was talking on a podcast yesterday, and I thought this was fundamental. He said, you know, one of the advantages that I have now in being a little bit older is I recognize that life in itself seems to be very mathematic and very coincidental for our destiny. And when you're in the middle of things, it seems like I couldn't understand why maybe I didn't get into medical school. I don't understand why this hardship happened to me. I'm not sure why XYZ occurred, but when you zoom out, you see that everything happens for a reason. When you didn't get into medical school, what were some of those conversations that you were having with yourself about kind of pivoting into a different space? I'm really interested in kind of how your heart reacted in that moment, or what kind of conversations you were having with your family or with yourself about a path that you thought was going to be there, but then you had to pivot and go in a different direction.
That's a really good question. You know, immediately I was devastated. You know, everyone told me I would be able to go wherever I wanted. And so the first thing I did is I went back to the universities where I applied, and I had conversations with the team. I wanted to know, what could I do to better myself? And those conversations themselves were enlightening. I'll never forget going into the room and sitting down and talking to, it was 3 men, all white men, all 80 plus years of age with their little bow ties on. And they sat there for about 40 minutes looking at my application. And I remember them looking up to me and saying, we have some concerns because you did not come from a typical upper middle class family who had produced doctors.
Wow.
I knew right then and there that this was not the field for me. And they tried to give me some resources. They told me to go to one of the programs that had been implemented for folks that weren't quite there, weren't quite ready for this, difficult choice of a career. And I remember standing up and looking at each one of them and telling them, thank you so much for instilling in me that this is not what I want to do, because I prepared myself. I know I would make a very successful doctor. I know that I would have been a great pediatrician because that was my love. But you know what? I'm going to do something that's even more powerful. I'm going to influence policy, and I'm going to make systemic changes that will be better for families in the long run. And I'm going to ensure that every child, whoever sits at this table again, anybody who wants to go will have an opportunity, because we can find alternative ways for people to get there. So I think they helped me to fill that void. And I'm also a very competitive person. So when I'm told no, it just makes me a little bit more energized, a little bit more excited to show and prove somebody wrong. And so I didn't stay depressed very long. I turned it around, and within a month I was enrolled in a master's degree program and pursuing a different avenue of how to get there.
What an amazing way to basically tell them to, a Southern phrase that I learned when I was living in South Carolina was bless your heart. right?
Exactly.
A
Exactly.
very polite way to tell them to
Well,
bless
I
their
have a
heart.
button on my desk and it says, bless your heart. So exactly. I use that phrase all of the time.
Oh my goodness. So one thing that I think is really interesting is thinking about how you can impact a space on a larger scale, right? Systemic change. Why did you start thinking about systemic change rather than just like the hand-to-hand combat of, being a provider? That's a really interesting perspective, especially at a young age, to realize the power that you had to have such influence.
I think for me, it was that I always knew I wanted to do something big. I wanted to have my hand in something that really made a difference. And, as I was planning to be a pediatrician, I wanted to go back to a rural area of the state. I wanted to be like Doc Hollywood. People pay me with pigs or the garden harvest that they had or whatever, because it wasn't about the money. It was about who and what I was doing, and it had to mean something to me. And so I think from that early age, I just decided that there's other ways to do it. There's other ways to get there. And so I remembered what people had told me, that I was very good. I had grandparents, parents who told me I could do anything I wanted to do. So I give a lot of credit to folks that built me up and told me I was important, that I was special, and that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And, that made me begin to think that even though I may not have come from that typical upper middle class family, I came from a family that had something better, a family that had love, a family that had a strong work ethic, and a family that had the belief in me. And it was all about those relationships. And the relationships that I'd built along the way with mentors and friends and people that told me that I could do it. And so those relationships were what I wanted to do, is to build those relationships and help other folks. So that really helped me to see that maybe there's a better way, and maybe there's a way that you can impact people at a much greater level, than just being a provider. Now, I did those steps along the way. When I first started teaching at the local community college, I ran the on-site childcare center there. And I did that for 8 years, and I loved it. And I was able to use it as a lab school, as a teaching mechanism for my students, so they could learn right then and there what they're doing right and how they could improve their skills. So I did do some of that, and I have that hands-on experience. And that's something that I also learned along the way, is that I think it's extremely important that you keep your foot and hands connected to the people that you're trying to make a difference for, and making sure that their voices are heard, that the families' voices are heard. Because I think too many times we have folks that move up the chain and they're in levels of power and position, but they've forgotten, or they've never been there on the ground to see those struggles that families face, or the struggles that children face. And so I've always, throughout my career, as I have moved into higher level positions, always kept myself grounded and kept my hands and feet on the ground to make sure I didn't lose that connection with the folks that I was trying to make a difference for.
I mean, I think that that's so fundamental. If you lose connection to the population of people who you're serving, you truly don't understand what you're actually creating in the policies that you're influencing to actually make a difference in their lives. I had a CEO of a food bank down in Georgia on the podcast, and we were talking about this exact topic. He said, a lot of leaders who we see ascend in organizations often come from the upper middle class, I would say socioeconomic space, very similar to what you got criticized for not being a part of. And when they come into these organizations or they try and influence policy, they're coming from a space and a lens where they truly don't understand the challenges of the people who they're trying to impact. And it's just so beautiful to hear that you've always been incredibly intentional about staying grounded so you can have the biggest impact and recognize the challenges that you're actually trying to fight instead of trying to create a solution in a vacuum, which I feel like is so powerful.
Definitely. I mean, that is one thing that I wanted to stay true to. And it's something that I have instilled in my own children. My daughters are both very successful and they have moved up in careers in um, science and math careers. One is a biomedical engineer and the other is a pediatric physical therapist. Both have graduate degrees, but they didn't get an option. I told them this was how you make the difference. And it's really exciting to me that they are telling me now as young adults that, those they are so thankful for the values that we instilled, my husband and I instilled in them, and that they are hard workers. They don't understand why people aren't invested in their work, why they don't work as hard as they do. But both of them are looking into roles of higher leadership. And so I know that they have those feelings, and I know we've instilled those same values in them as well.
I want to get a little bit more tactical in the conversation. So Dr. Snuggs now starts recognizing that she has to make a difference on a larger scale. What are the first low-hanging fruit opportunities that you see out there as an opportunity for you to start impacting policy and impacting change? What are some of the things that you start targeting first?
So there are so many challenges in the field of early care and education. And those challenges have been long-standing. I've been in this field for over 30 years. And unfortunately, many of the things that we saw early in my career are still the same issues that we're dealing with today. I work for a small nonprofit in the Triangle region of North Carolina, and we base our initiatives and our innovations on data. And so one of the first things we did, we've been in existence for 50 years, but one of the first things they did is they did a workforce study of the early childhood field. And that was in the late 1980s. And what they found in that workforce study was that there were three huge issues in the field of early childhood. One was the salaries of the workforce. They were extremely low. Two was that it was an undereducated workforce. And the third thing was that there was high turnover. Not surprising for the type of work that was being done. And those same challenges are the same three things that we're still dealing with today. And so if you look at it on a broader scale, what I would say to me as I have begun to look in and really think about what those challenges are, one is the severe underfunding of the early care and education field. And when we talk about early care and education, typically we talk about prenatal up to third grade. And it is just the amount of funding that's invested in the state that I work in or in any place in the country in the United States. It is so minimal in comparison to the K-12 system or even the higher education system. In North Carolina, for example, we have had years of underfunding. We have not seen any type of increase. We have seen a steady amount of funding in early childhood in North Carolina since 2011. But we have seen dramatic increases in K-12 and higher education. The funding in early childhood has been it's been in the millions, but under $1 billion for all of those years. Higher ed has seen a 35% increase, over $2 billion over that same time span. And K-12 education has seen a 42% increase, almost $5 billion more. If we look at it just on a dollar amount, early childhood education gets a couple of cents per every dollar that the other levels of education get. Now, while I am an educator, I've been in higher ed, I believe every level of education is underfunded. The early childhood area is considerably underfunded. So that is such a huge challenge that we're faced with. And what makes it even more frustrating is it receives this minimal amount of funding, but research has shown that it is the most crucial time in a person's life. More development occurs in those first 2,000 days. And then likewise in those first 5 years than any other time in a person's life. And we're not investing in it where we could make the biggest difference. And then the investment that we make can have long-term effects. So that is a huge component. Another extreme challenge is we forget about what kind of impact this has on the children themselves, but also on the families. That lack of funding impacts those long-term outcomes. For example, we know for a fact that if they are in high quality early care and education, it impacts their third grade reading and math scores. We know that those scores are considerably higher at third grade, but they're also higher even at high school and on. We know that graduation rates are higher. We know that those children are less likely to commit crimes or become incarcerated. They're less likely to drop out of high school, higher graduation rates. We also know for families, it gives them an opportunity to pursue careers, to make higher wages so that they can then in turn further invest in their families and take care of their children. And we know that it has an impact on the state, the economic vitality of the state. And then there's all of these, as you start to try to work through these issues, there's all these legislative and systemic barriers. Policymakers have overlooked early childhood education for years. And I think there's some reasons for that. I think it goes back to some of the things that I have experienced even in my own life. And I think it's a reason that I stay so passionate about changing those systemic barriers. But one of the things that I hear on a regular basis is that parents should be in charge of their children and they should be educating them. And we don't need to worry about early care and education. That's a parent's job. They're also saying it's babysitting. Nothing is happening during those years. So it doesn't matter. And there's no reason to invest in that time frame. And then there is, unfortunately, still embedded in our country today, systemic racism, because over 60% of the folks that make up this field, the teachers in this field, are Black and brown women. So it's systemic sexism and racism at its best.
First of all, the passion in which you speak about with this topic is incredibly inspiring, because knowing that there are people who are influencing policy that have such a strong feeling for why these things are important, Dr. Kristi, is incredibly important. Something that you mentioned there started making me go down like an analogy in my mind, which is more important, to plant a seed in poor soil, expect it to grow, and then pour a ton of money and water on it at the end of its harvesting process to say this is going to solve the problem? Or do we invest into the soil, which is the foundation in the early stages of helping a crop grow to become a more harvestable crop? And I feel like we're missing the early stages, and we'll use our children as crops here, by not investing into the soil, but expecting to dump resources into the later harvesting process in higher education and K through 12, which don't really have an impact. It's like we're missing the entire beginning of the race to only shove resources at the end and say everything's okay now. It seems like a completely backwards way of approaching this.
That's exactly the way I see it. You know, there's a parable that we all have heard, and it's exactly what you said. It depends on where you plant those seeds. If you put those seeds on rocky ground, they might grow for a little while, but they're going to get strangled out and move. And the way I see that is as a child who maybe has had trauma in their life and it gets strangled out, and there's not the investment in the early years, that foundation that they need. And likewise, just like you've said, if we would take the time to cultivate the soil, to invest in teachers that are working with these children, and they're in partnership with families. no one's saying we should leave the families out of the picture. The families have to be part of the picture, but it's in partnership with those families. You're working together. The teachers can help the families to understand how to deliver, because none of us are prepared to be a parent. I wasn't prepared to be a parent. My own daughter just had a baby and she's like, I don't know what I'm doing. We learn. It's about trial and error. But when we have teachers that are educated and they understand that what kind of development is taking place, they understand that building that relationship and making that child's physical needs be met, making sure they're not hungry, that they feel safe and secure, that they have a safe place to stay, that they actually touch the child and actually make eye contact with that child at an early age before the child's able to speak themselves. That child reads that and knows that that person cares. And it builds that self accountability. It builds that self-sufficiency of the child. It's a parallel process. What the teacher is doing, the child is developing along at the same rate or even faster. But that teacher can make that difference by taking care of those physical needs, by making that child feel secure and safe, by showing them that you care about them and that you love them and you are building that social relationship. What that does is that instills a component of self-awareness and self-confidence in that child. And then that child is able to open up and begin to soak in all of that sun, all of that rain, and grow and become this magnificent individual that, if they don't do those things, they don't have that opportunity. Our brains are like soil. There's pathways and we have to connect those neurons. As young children, they're seeing it all for the first time and they're making those connections. And the adults in their lives, the family members, the teachers, they're making those connections for those children. And then the more those connections happen over and over again, those pathways get burnt into our brains and they make sense and they stay and our whole brain begins to develop. And it even goes to this frontal cortex where all of the learning takes place. But if children are in environments where there's constant stress, where there's not those, where they don't feel safe, they're not loved, and I'm not saying families don't do that, but there's so many challenges facing families today that they need support and need help. And if we will just invest in those early years, those brains are so fertile. They can capture so much information and it can make a difference in the lives of those children and those families from then on.
So recognizing through how you're speaking about this, the writing is on the wall. This is incredibly important. This investment is more needed than ever, especially where we're at in a societal perspective today. We have to invest into the younger generation. But why is the average wage of an early childhood educator $14.50? How can we survive off of money like that? What's going on?
So, I've thought a lot about this, and I think for years, back in the 1950s in our country, for example, most moms stayed home. So there wasn't a need for there to be this educational facility for young children because parents stayed home. Dads went out and earned the living. And there were two-parent families. That is not what we look like anymore. Family arrangements are so different. Most, because of the inflation and everything the higher costs, most parents in the home are working. And so right now, the way the industry has been, I think has evolved is it started with people keeping children in their homes. And then it eventually, as more and more was needed, there were larger arrangements. And so it sort of grew from this idea of maybe we can help each other, families or grandparents or whomever might help. And there was never really a business model that was created to really help early childhood centers or homes develop. Most people just did it because they like children and they were good at it, or kids like them. And so what has happened is it's predominantly private small businesses that are run, and the only funding that they get, unless there are particular, they want to serve lower income families where there might be some subsidized money, subsidized childcare available, or they want to serve children that have developmental disabilities where there may be some additional funding. The bulk of where the funding comes from is parents. Parents have to pay for the service. And parents can only pay so much. And right now, families are paying an average of about 20%, between 18 and 20% of their income on early care and education if they have young children below the age of 6. Unfortunately, single parent families and lower income families are paying in upwards of 50 to 70% of their income in childcare.
How did we get by with a huge percentage? Like, I'm just trying to think about what are the stresses? You don't.
And that's why families are so stressed. That puts extra trauma on the children. And so you have this one source. It's on the backs of parents that are paying the child care costs. Parents can't afford to pay any more. The number one cost for childcare facility is the staffing. And so you pay them what you can afford to charge the parents, which is not that much. And therefore, then you have to turn around and you can only pay your teachers what you're able to bring in from a revenue standpoint. And then because they're being paid $14 an hour, they don't stay. We tell them they have to have education. That costs money. There's student loans and other things that they then have to go back and pay. They want to go somewhere where they can make a living wage. And on top of that, because they're small businesses, most of them do not have a large number of employees. There's usually not health care available. Less than 25% of the child care environments actually provide any type of benefits to their teachers. So the teachers can't afford to stay. They're not making a living wage themselves. Over 60% of our teachers in the field are parents themselves. So they have this cost of their own child care. And then they're not able to provide for their own family. So they have to find something better. So it's just this vicious cycle, and it's an unsustainable model that no one has looked at. And you're right. The writing is on the wall. The research is there. People know the brain development is occurring, but it's the cost, and it would cost a tremendous amount of money. During the pandemic, we finally were able to elevate the profession to the level that I think it deserved, because when everything started shutting down, doctors, those frontline workers could not go to work without childcare, because it truly is the workforce behind the workforce. And so people began to recognize how important early care and education teachers were. And so, we began to invest. The federal government invested just in North Carolina over $2 billion. Well, that helped us raise wages about $3 to $14.50 an hour. They were making much less than that before. And at the same time, inflation and cost on everything else went up. And so in the research that we've done at early years, what we saw that is in 2019, they might have been making $3 less, but based on inflationary increases, they're actually making less now than they were prior to the pandemic.
So how do you stay positive with all of this, right? We've been talking a lot about the challenges that we're facing. The writing's on the wall. Inflation's growing. We don't have enough money. $2 billion equates to $3 an hour more for everybody. Inflation eats that up. So how are you staying optimistic about this opportunity that's in front of us?
I think one of the things that keeps me optimistic is I look in the faces of the children that we're doing this for, and you see that they have the potential to do anything and everything they want to do. And so I'm reminded that they're our future. They're going to be the ones taking care of us as we get older. And we want them to live in a society, and we want them to have the opportunities that we've had. Also, families are doing the best they can, and we want to support families. I mean, I had a wonderful family. I still have a wonderful family, but I was raised in an environment where people cared about each other and loved each other. And I just believe that people are still good. And it makes me feel good when you can talk to a provider, and, you can give them some type of salary or wage supplement, $2,400, maybe more a year. And they're like, this is what kept the lights in my home on. This is why I stay in this field. And you see them turn around and invest in those children and encourage them in ways that it's just hard to explain. But, I just wish, and I guess the other part that I would say is that I've seen small successes as we've moved. We have seen our childcare system have quality, move toward quality. We have had 30 years of success in North Carolina, where we've seen the 4- and 5-star centers, which are the quality centers, increased dramatically. We've seen people, a marginalized population, have opportunities to get education and better themselves, not only maybe just from a salary perspective, but better themselves with knowledge and understanding that gives them opportunities to do other things. And also, education is something that you can't take away. It is something that, just instills confidence in yourself. And so those small gains that you see keeps me positive. And the fact that I still believe that people do care about other people, and that we can change this tide. We just have to get in front of the right people. We have to get, businesses to understand that their bottom line, their revenue is dependent upon having workers. And in order to have workers that you need in their most, in the years where they're the best workers, where they can do the hard jobs, the jobs that no one else wants, is during the early part of their careers. And that is the time when they're having children. They're typically earning less during that time, but you have to have those frontline workers. And in order to have those, you have to have care for children. And so I just think that we need to think about it, and how we can invest, and how we can bring businesses to the table. And I think that's a change that we've seen in the last couple of years.
Well, it's incredibly easy for me to understand why you're a guest on this podcast, because the heart that you have behind this hustle is amazing. And just hearing so much passion that you have, and the perspectives of investing into the right places will make the long tail investment worth it, is something that I think we need to echo a little bit more. Dr. Kristi, if you had to answer a question, what is your legacy going to be when you're done with all of this?
Well, I think I've had tremendous opportunities in my life. And, I started this conversation today talking about I didn't get into med school. I wasn't able to pursue the path that I had prepared myself for. But then there were so many doors that opened. I was able to work at the state level. I was able to expand early childhood education to all 58 community colleges in North Carolina, and make it a program that was available anywhere, and people didn't have an excuse of why they needed to go back. I was able to see legislation through to the end and help people get their higher education degrees. I was able, after 25 years, to see state level articulation from our community college 2-year system and our 4-year system. Didn't think that would ever happen, but that did happen. And I was instrumental in that. Then I was able to rise in the ranks and become a chief academic officer, and be able to visit other colleges across the nation and share our innovations and how we took some of those systemic barriers out of the way, and help meet people where they were, and help people that never would have had an opportunity to go to college earn degrees and have successful careers. I was in the place at the right time when the pandemic hit. You think a global pandemic is a positive? Yes, for me it was. I was able to lead the Division of Child Development, our state agency that was able to save childcare in North Carolina. And while other states saw a dramatic decrease in the number of childcare centers that closed in the workforce, North Carolina was spared. We saw an increase in our workforce. We only, over the course of since 2020 till now, we've seen 280 facilities close, which is a lot. But in the comparison of almost 6,000 programs, it was a very minuscule amount. And I was also able to make sure that those providers had what they needed to remain open and stay. So for me, every childcare provider in North Carolina has my cell phone number, I think. They call me when they have a question. So I guess one of the pieces of the legacy that I will leave is that I was there and I was a friend, and it was someone that they trusted and they could ask questions of, and I would help them to find innovative solutions. That's the legacy I want to leave. And I've had the tremendous chance to do that.
So where is your statue going up in North Carolina where we can look at, the memorialization of all the amazing work that you've done, Dr. Snuggs? I think it's so appropriate to start thinking about where that's going to be.
I don't need that. I don't need that recognition. I just need to see that children are getting a chance and that they're having an opportunity to reach their optimal potential, and that people are helping them along the way. And we're preparing those educators to build those trusting relationships with those children and prepare for our future. And maybe my children or someone else's children will take care of me when I lose my mind and can't think anymore,
Well, Dr. Snuggs, I'm so gracious for you coming on the show. I appreciate, the time that we've been able to spend together. You are the definition of Hart and Hustle. There's no question about it. One of the traditions we have here on the podcast is our previous guest wants to ask you a blind question. Now, our previous guest is an amazing leader from an organization in New York City, who is just redefining what after-school programs mean for the younger generation. Her question was, if you have unlimited resources and unlimited time to apply to a single project, what would that be?
If I had unlimited resources and unlimited time to apply to a single project, what would that be? I would pay early childhood educators a living wage, and I would do some type of campaign that put their faces front and center about the importance of their role, because they are so underappreciated and they deserve to be millionaires.
Well, that's a beautiful place for us to put a wrap on today's episode. Once again, for everybody who's been tuning in, watching, and listening, Dr. Kristi Snuggs, thank you so much for the time that we've been able to spend together. It's been an absolute pleasure. And you, again, are the definition of Hart and Hustle. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really have enjoyed our time together today.